Hi, so today I want to address something I was personally really annoyed with. I watched another YouTuber's video where I don't know if he's a polyglot or just talks about languages, where he says that you should learn the 1,000 most frequent words in a language. And I really don't agree with that. And I thought, why don't I make a video myself discussing that? Because I think it's a really important topic because, honestly, it's probably the most important thing in a language. Just acquiring new words and expanding your vocabulary. So in this video, I will discuss three strategies that you can use in order to learn new words and talk about pros and cons of each, and then tell you which one I personally use and recommend to my students. Let's begin. So the first strategy is not really like a strategy in itself. It's just a lazy way to learn words. When you attend a language course or you just learn a language at school, or even if you're learning a language on your own and you have a textbook, and most textbooks have vocabulary lists where you can see all the words that you need to learn for this unit or for the whole book or for this level, etc. And you just take this list and you just learn these words one by one, which is, I agree, is really easy and straightforward technique. You don't need to think about it. You just take the list and you just learn the words. And most often it's also really convenient because if it's a textbook, then you also have text and maybe some audios and videos with these words, so you not just learn them but you then also practice them with this material from the book. But from my own experience, it's rarely the most useful words for you because honestly, I think in all the language courses that I took, when I took them from the very beginning, they were words that I never or rarely use in my life, like animals. Really, in most language courses, they make you learn animal names. And I rarely talk about animals. I don't have kids, I don't go to zoos, and I just don't need these words. So basically, I just waste my time learning them because I don't use them and so I forget them. Because as I mentioned in my previous video, if you don't constantly, or at least for a certain period of time, don't use the words that you've just learned, they will just vanish from your memory, and that's just a natural process because otherwise our brain would have been swollen with information that we don't need. So even though going with the easy way and learning words your textbook provides is pretty easy and effortless, I think it's not really useful in the long run because most of this, well, maybe not most, but a lot of this vocabulary is irrelevant, like animals or big numbers. Like sometimes in a lesson or two, you have to learn all the numbers from 1 to 1,000,000, and you rarely use those. So I think in the early stages of your language learning process, it doesn't make sense to put your efforts into learning these particular words because you won't be using them as much, so you will have to relearn them later on anyway. Another strategy that you can use that is also almost as easy and straightforward as just learning words from the list in your textbook is using Minilex. So Minilex is basically a list of words that are most frequently used in a language. You can find the most frequently used words for most popular languages, I would say. And basically, it's a huge list of words where they are ranked by frequency. I think this is also not a really good method to learn words, regardless of its simplicity, because again, you will learn the most frequent words, but the frequency is average. So it's like the most frequent words used by a very average native speaker, which we don't doesn't exist. It's like the pilot seat story when they designed the perfect pilot seat using the data of all or most of the pilots of the country. I think it was in the US. And basically, it was supposed to be designed in a way that made sure that most pilots could perfectly fit in this seat and also feel comfortable enough for like long to take long flights. But actually, later on they found out that this kind of person, like this kind of pilot with these characteristics, with this height, with this weight, with this arm length, etc., doesn't exist. So then they came up with the idea to actually make an adjustable seat. So every single pilot could adjust it for themselves. And by the same logic, you can also claim that there's no average native speaker or no average language learner, because every single person has different interests, different fields of professional expertise, different things they talk about on a daily basis. And even though a lot of people probably talk about the same things, but they might use different vocabulary to talk about these things. So this list kind of makes sense, but also it doesn't. But this strategy is even worse than the previous one, because at least in a textbook you have the accompanying text or audio or something where you see how these words are used and how to use them in a sentence. But if it's just a frequency dictionary, you just see a list of words and that's it. Well, normally there's, for each word there's a one or two sentences, but it's not enough because it's just one sentence and it's not a lot of context and it's not a great way to memorize words. So I think the optimal way to learn new vocabulary is to create your own mini lex, your own vocabulary lists that are relevant for you, that you will be using and that you are already using, but maybe in your native language or in another language, and you know that you will use this word, so you will actually retain them properly, as I explained in my previous video. And this method obviously requires more work and more efforts and more time, but it totally pays off because you end up learning the right words and you don't need to literally learn them later on, because if you learn animals, then you learn them in your third week of your language course, and then 3 years later you realize that, oh, now I actually need to talk about animals, and you have to learn them again. I think putting the efforts in the very beginning makes more sense than spreading them throughout years and making your future self do the work. So how do you actually do it? There's a lot of ways depending on what type of learner you are. I'm going to talk about the ways I prefer to learn words myself. So first, I listen to a lot of podcasts because for me it's the best, and even though the laziest, but it's a really efficient way to learn languages. And so I listen to a podcast when I don't have time, when I'm doing something else that doesn't really require any intellectual activity, so I can actually pay attention to the language. And then when I hear a word that is important, that seems important, or I, I think that I've heard it before and I still don't remember it or just don't know it, I take a second and I take a quick note. I write it down in my phone notes or on a piece of paper, so that when I do have time later on, I come back to it and I write a translation or I write an example. Sometimes I don't just write down one word, but I write down the whole sentence where this word was used, so that I have the context. But this sentence is different from sentences from the dictionary, because when I later on read the sentence, I will remember the whole podcast and I will have a lot of context. On the same note, it's also really efficient because when you listen to a podcast, especially when you listen a lot to the same podcast, you build a kind of connection to the host or people who are being interviewed, or, just people who talk in this podcast. And well, even if you don't have a connection, they're still people, and when they talk, you can hear their emotions, or maybe you have your own emotions caused by what they're saying. So it's not just the context, but you also link emotions to this word, and we tend to remember emotional things better. Like if something really produced strong emotions in us, then it's much, much, much more likely that we'll remember this. So after a while, I have a list of words, or maybe just a note with sentences and words from a podcast. It can be different episodes, it can be the same episode. This is the list of words that I concentrate on and will be learning for the next couple of days and maybe weeks. And then I do the same with books or articles that I read. I sometimes take notes in my phone notes or on paper, and sometimes I just highlight words or sentences like in the book or, in my browser to save them for later. And in this case, like if you read a lot, if you prefer to read and learn through reading, there's a lot of really useful apps that you can use. For example, the one I use is called Link. There's an extension for a browser that allows you to save words directly to the app, and then you can automatically create flashcards with the words that you marked as new ones. So this is even easier to learn them afterwards. Like you read an article and then you can go to your flashcards and go through all the new words you've seen there. But these techniques are more for intermediate or advanced learners. If you're a beginner and you can't just open any article or just listen to any podcast, what you can do is just look at your interest or open an article on something from your professional field and maybe try to translate it or try to find the most frequent words, or imagine that you're talking to someone explaining something from your work or your hobby or something you're really interested in, and just try to explain it in your new language, and you will really quickly realize which words are lacking, and you just learn them, and you can make a list. But honestly, these kind of words, especially at the very beginning, they you learn them really easily because these are the actual words that you need, and you will be using them a lot. Like when you introduce yourself and you want to say, hey, I am this and this, and I do this and this, and in my work I have accomplished this and this, and you will be saying this a lot. And that's why it's crucial to learn these words in the beginning. And also, it's really efficient because you won't have to relearn them later because you will actually be using them all the time. And then as you go on, you expand to more difficult words or maybe more complex sentence structure. And then you also look at connectors, words like but, therefore, moreover, and stuff like that. And also more complex terms that you want to use in your introductions or just conversations. It can be any topic, even if you talk about something that is not relevant to your work, it can be a very basic topic, but when you talk about it, you will realize that, oh, I need this word in order to explain this. What I do when I start a new language, I basically just talk to myself. Sometimes I'm lucky and I find a language partner that I talk to in this new language, and they help me with the new words. So I'm talking about something, and when I need a new word, they write it down, or they say it to me, and then I write it down. And this way, I come back to these words later because apparently these are the words that I really need. If you don't have a language partner, you can just talk to yourself. You will feel those moments when you need this word that you don't know, that doesn't let your explanation flow, that doesn't let you speak without pauses or without uh, and stuff like that. And this is how you form your own personalized mini lex, which is only a mini lex in the very beginning, but then it becomes a big and extended vocabulary. So this was my take on learning new vocabulary. Let me know if it was useful, and also share how you learn new words and if you maybe use one of the methods that I mentioned.